Hello and welcome back to Neo-Psychology with me, your teacher, Mr. Neo, the channel where I teach online psychology lessons for my wonderful students. Today we're carrying on with the unit of social influence and we're looking at lesson 6, obedience, the agentic state and legitimacy of authority. Let's do this. Here's the starter. In Milgram's study of obedience to authority, whose fault was it that the learner got electric shocked? Okay, of course, as we know, no one was actually getting electric shocks, but hypothetically, if someone was being shocked, whose fault was it? Was it the experimenter who was asking the teacher to give electric shocks, or was it the teacher's fault for giving those shocks? Milgram's research into obedience is often described as being counterintuitive and that the results go against what we might reasonably expect given our knowledge of human behavior. We weren't expecting such a high proportion of people to go and give and administer the highest 450 volt shock to strangers just because somebody in a lab coat asked them to. What Milgram seems to have demonstrated is the power of the situation in shaping behavior. With moral constraints and compassion being sidelined when the individual is confronted by a powerful authority figure. Right, we've got 3 learning objectives today. We're going to have a look at the agentic state, we're going to look at legitimacy of authority, and then we're going to discuss and evaluate those 2 concepts. Let's start with the agentic state. The agentic state is when you act on behalf of another person. Milgram proposed that obedience to destructive authority occurs because a person becomes an agent, someone who acts for or in place of another. In an agentic state, a person feels no personal responsibility for their actions. Right, so you're an agent. I'm not doing this on my own behalf. Someone's asking me to do this, so therefore I'm going to do it. I likened it to like 007, you know, he's not the one who wants to kill these people. He's an agent. He's being asked to do these things. I don't take responsibility for this. I've been asked to do this and I'm going to kill these people, right? It's not me that wants to do it. That's an agentic state. You act on behalf of another person. The opposite of an agentic state is an autonomous state, not an agent. Autonomy means to be independent or free. So a person in an autonomous state behaves according to their principles and feels responsible for their actions. Okay? So if I'm in an autonomous state, I realize that there are consequences to my actions regardless of who's asking me to do this. An agentic shift is from going from an autonomous state to an agentic state. The shift from autonomy to being an agent is called an agentic shift. Milgram suggested that this occurs when we perceive someone else as an authority figure. This person has power because of their position in a social hierarchy. You know, we don't go around in an agentic state all the time. Someone asks me to do this, so I go and do it instantly. No, that's not how it works. Generally, we go around in an autonomous state and we do things because we want to do them, or we do things and we expect consequences for our actions. However, according to Milgram, when we have an authority figure or someone we perceive to be an authority figure, we may have an agentic shift into a agentic state and then do as they say. Binding factors. When in the agentic state, the individual is kept in it, so in the agentic state, by binding factors. For example, the fear of appearing rude by refusing to obey the authority's figure's commands. So, what is the agentic state? Fill in the gaps, give that a go. Keywords are important. The agentic state is a mental state where we feel no personal responsibility for our behavior because we believe ourselves to be acting for an authority figure, i.e. as their agent. This frees us from the demands of our conscience and allows us to obey even a destructive authority figure. Right, let's have a look at an application question. This is the massacre of My Lai, the My Lai massacre. Milgram's findings have been used to explain the notorious war crime at My Lai in 1968 during the Vietnam War. As many as 504 unarmed civilians were killed by American soldiers. Women were gang raped and people were shot down as they emerged from their homes with their hands in the air. The soldiers blew up buildings, burned the village to the ground, and killed all the animals. Only one soldier faced charges and was found guilty, Lieutenant William Cayley. His defense was the same as the Nazi officers at the Nuremberg trial, that he was only doing his duty by following orders. Can you explain the behavior of these soldiers in terms of the agentic state, right? Application question, quote parts of the question in your answer, explain what the agentic state is, use those key terms, autonomous state, agentic shift, binding factors in your answer. Give that a go now, please. Pause the video because I'm going to go through the answer now. Right, the agentic state. The soldiers on the ground at My Lai took their orders from their commanding officer, Lieutenant Cayley. He took his orders from higher ranking officers in other locations. All could deny personal responsibility for their behavior because they perceived themselves to be acting as agents of a higher authority. They were not following the dictates of their own conscience, so were not in an autonomous state where they could have behaved freely and independently. This agentic shift occurred when the soldiers joined the army. And that's the agentic state. Can you identify one thing you've learned about the agentic state? Why do you think learning about this is important? How can you apply this to real life? What was the hardest part of the agentic state to understand? And has this raised any questions for you? Feel free to leave them in the comments. I'm sure someone will answer them. And that's the agentic state. Next one we're going to look at is legitimacy of authority. Let's have a look. We obey people further up a social hierarchy. Most societies are structured hierarchically. People in certain positions hold authority over the rest of us. For example, parents, teachers, police officers, nightclub bouncers. Society is hierarchical in so many senses. Even animals have hierarchy. It's natural, it's innate. Authorities have legitimacy through social agreement. The power that authorities wield is legitimate because it is agreed by society. Most of us accept that authority figures should exercise social power over others to allow society to function smoothly. We hand control over to authority figures. People with legitimate authority have the power to punish others. We give up some independence to people we trust to exercise authority properly. We learn to accept authority during childhood, right? You learn to obey parents, you learn to obey teachers. If you don't obey them, then you should be punished. But leaders may use legitimate powers for destructive purposes. History has shown that some leaders, Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, use legitimate authority destructively, ordering people to behave in cruel and dangerous ways. So, what's the definition of legitimacy of authority? Give that a go, please. We're going to look at it now. It's an explanation for obedience, which suggests that we are more likely to obey people who we perceive to have authority over us, right? As one would expect. The authority is justified or legitimate by the individual's position of power within a social hierarchy. Okay, so it's an explanation of why people are obedient. They are more likely to be obedient because we perceive them to have authority over us. Here we go. Same question again. My Lai massacre. Milgram's findings have been used to explain the notorious war crime at My Lai in 1968 during the Vietnam War. As many as 504 unarmed civilians were killed by American soldiers, women were gang raped, and people were shot down as they emerged from their homes with their hands in the air. The soldiers blew up buildings, burned the village to the ground, and killed all the animals. Only one soldier faced charges and was found guilty, Lieutenant William Cayley. His defense was the same as the Nazi officers at the Nuremberg trials, that he was only doing his duty to follow orders. Can you explain the behavior of the soldiers, this time in terms of legitimacy of authority? Okay, give that a go now, please. Pause the video. Again, quote parts of the question in your answer. Let's have a look at the answer. The army is a perfect example of an extremely structured hierarchy in which power increases with rank. The officer who ranks above you has the power to punish your failure to obey. His or her authority is made legitimate by the law, the government and the army itself. The soldiers at My Lai accepted that Lieutenant Cayley was entitled to expect their obedience because of his position in the army's hierarchy and his power to punish them. Lieutenant Cayley's attitude to his commanding officer would have been identical, and so on up the chain of command. The outcome was obedience to destructive authority at every level. And that's legitimacy of authority. Can you identify one thing you've learned about legitimacy of authority? Why do you think learning about this is important? What was the hardest part to understand about this? And what questions has this raised for you? There we go. Second learning objective done. Now we're going to have a look at discussing and evaluating both the agentic state and legitimacy of authority. What are the strengths and limitations of these two concepts? Right. First of all, we've got support for the agentic state. Most of Milgram's participants asked the experimenter who is responsible if Mr. Wallace, the learner, is harmed. When the experimenter replied, "I'm responsible," the participants went through the procedure quickly without objecting. This shows participants acted more easily as an agent when they believed they were not responsible for their behavior. So we've got supporting evidence from Milgram's study himself, right? Those participants said, "Who's responsible?" When the experiment said, "I'm responsible," they were fine with giving electric shocks, because they were acting as agents. They went from the autonomous state, they had an agentic shift into the agentic state. However, there is conflicting evidence of the agentic state from real life. Rank and Jacobson found that most nurses disobeyed a doctor's order to give an excessive drug dose. The doctor was an authority figure, but the nurses remained autonomous and did not shift into an agentic state. The same is true for some of Milgram's participants. This shows that agentic shift can only explain obedience in some situations. So this is a limitation, this is conflicting evidence. If a doctor, who obviously has more authority over a nurse, said, "Can you give this drug?" when the nurses knew that it was a lethal dose or it wouldn't have been excessive, they didn't give it. Even though they could have shifted into the agentic state and said, "Well, the doctor has authority over me, therefore I'm going to do it." That wasn't the case. So there is conflicting evidence that doesn't always happen. Finally, real-world crimes for obedience. Research shows that some people disobey legitimate authority. For example, Rank and Jacobson, the nurses disobeyed a doctor, even in a hierarchy. But soldiers at My Lai obeyed their commanding officer. Maybe he had more power to punish than a doctor, Kelman and Hamilton. Therefore, there is some evidence in real-world situations that respect for legitimate authority can lead to destructive obedience. So the example of the My Lai massacre is a good real-world example of legitimacy of authority. That is a strength. Can you summarize each evaluative point into your own words? If you want to challenge yourself, can you do it into exactly 10 words? Give that a go now. Otherwise, we finished. Well done, guys. That was lesson 6, obedience, the agentic state and legitimacy of authority. Next lesson, we've got obedience, the authoritarian personality. Right? Great work today. Write up your notes. Give that a go. Well done, my neo-psychologist. Great job today. God bless and peace.
I'm feeling like Will. I feel like a prince. I'm feeling myself. I'm loaded with bills, cause I wasn't blessed with no Uncle Phil. Don't know how it feels. I wanted to flex, they told me to chill. I'm making a flip. My life is a flick, now load up the film.